Welcome to the Parallel World Library, where we explore strange and fascinating stories in other dimensions. Now, let's relax your body and take your mind to another world. Number 13, Mint Street by TunaV. Chapter 21, There's a Monster, 1. Speaking of equality for all beings, the Inmaraes family's hearse could have achieved this to the extreme. Whether living passengers or dead ones, all had to endure the cramped conditions in this car. Ron had long since developed a habit, his head pressed into a corner of the car, legs curled up. A big fat man in this posture seemed quite contradictory, but it allowed him to guarantee the most significant degree of stability, even letting out snores. Sylvan, on the other hand, sat with some difficulty. He constantly needed to use his hands to brace against the floor to maintain his balance. The roads in the city were bearable, but after reaching the outskirts, they deteriorated, making the bumpy ride extremely uncomfortable. Jeff and Mr. Mosen were even more shameless, constantly bumping into each other during the jolts. This posture was like lovers lying in bed, whispering to each other. Sylvan couldn't bear to look and kept trying to pull the two apart, but in such cramped car space, they would quickly find each other again with each bump, embracing once more. If family members were accompanying the bodies, this situation wouldn't occur. At least, they would be placed in coffins to limit movement. But Jeff was a loner, relying on a welfare ticket, and Mr. Mosan was nearly the same. Regarding the family's work attitude, Sylvan had no right to interfere. Even though he had cooked lunch today, he was still essentially a parasite in this house. Finally, Uncle Mason turned the steering wheel to the left, and the hearse drove into a small factory-like courtyard with a sign hanging at the entrance. Crematorium.
Hey, Ron, wake up!
Uncle Mason shouted while knocking on the car door.
Ah, we're here.
Ron wiped his drool and stretched his back. Sylvan first helped set down the stretcher. Then, together with Ron, they transferred Jeff and Mr. Mosan down. Uncle Mason was responsible for keeping the stretcher from slipping. At this moment, a middle-aged woman wearing gray work clothes approached, holding paper and a pen.
Ah, a handsome young man.
The woman stared at Sylvan first.
Mrs. Hughes, hello, ma'am.
Ron greeted warmly. This was the person Paul had mentioned, Mrs. Hughes, who liked Ron. However, faced with Ron's enthusiasm, Mrs. Hughes only slightly stretched the corners of her mouth in response, instead placing more attention on Sylvan. In fact, Mrs. Hughes's appearance wasn't bad. Although she was wearing work clothes, one could still see her full figure, and her skin was very fair. Nevertheless, when Mrs. Hughes's hand pinched his face, Sylvan still uncomfortably pushed her hand away. Although he could adapt to this attractive body, he wasn't comfortable being treated like a boy to be teased. But Mrs. Hughes directly grabbed Sylvan's hand, her fingertips brushing back and forth in his palm, the provocative intent extremely clear. From her eyes, Sylvan could see the greedy look of middle-aged uncles when looking at young girls.
He's Sylvan, my brother's son.
Uncle Mason offered a cigarette.
Ah,
Mrs. Hughes was a bit surprised.
your nephew?
Mrs. Hughes took the cigarette, letting Mason light it for her, and continued.
I've never seen him before.
One of our staff had some business, and I got slightly injured. Uncle Mason explained.
Injured?
Accidentally fell.
Fell while climbing through some lady's window?
Don't joke like that. By the way, not busy today?
There's one ahead being cremated. It'll be done in a bit.
Only one furnace open?
I'd like to open a few more, but you only bring me this many guests. Does running furnaces not cost money?
All right, let's bring the guests in.
Okay, I'll go arrange things first. Handsome boy, see you in a bit.
Mrs. Hughes threw a flirtatious glance at Sylvan before turning to go in first. Ron pushed Mr. Mosan inside while Mason helped Sylvan push Jeff's stretcher.
Mrs. Hughes is a very enthusiastic person.
Mason lowered his voice and said to Sylvan.
Yes, indeed.
Sylvan nodded.
Her husband died early. She's managing this crematorium now. Though not remarried, she has no shortage of lovers.
Uncle, you don't need to tell me these things.
Ah, must remind you. I've been through your age too, you know.
Mason tapped on the stretcher's metal, making a clang-clang sound.
Young men at this age, even metal can be pierced through. You're older now, find a proper girlfriend in the future.
Mason instructed again.
All right, Uncle, I understand.
Sylvan realized Mason wasn't intentionally bad-mouthing Mrs. Hughes, but rather hoping his young nephew wouldn't lose himself and be trapped by Mrs. Hughes. After entering, Sylvan smelled an oily scent. It was not fragrant or sweet, somewhat like a bedroom that had gone moldy due to the weather. From the interior arrangement, one could tell this place was old. This must be a crematorium with some years behind it. Chapter 22, There's a Monster. 2.
Years ago, this crematorium was almost unable to stay open, nearly bought out by a larger crematorium.
Then what happened?
Sylvan asked.
Then that big crematorium was discovered to save costs by only running the furnaces at night, all at once. They'd give the ashes of the previous day's guests to today's bereaved families.
Hearing this, Sylvan's eyes widened.
Isn't that...
Yes, people brought their loved ones for cremation, then took home strangers' ashes. The funniest part is they actually kept this up for several years.
That's too cruel.
After that scandal broke, the owner of that crematorium was mysteriously stoned to death one night. The police couldn't find the killer because there were too many suspects with motives.
Sylvan nodded, saying,
He deserved to die.
putting himself in others' shoes if he had lost a loved one, brought them here for cremation, and ended up taking home some stranger's ashes, even worshipping that urn for years. Sylvan felt he'd have the urge to kill too.
After that big crematorium went bankrupt, Mrs. Hughes's crematorium managed to survive, though it's struggling now. Other cities have long since seen large-scale funeral companies emerge. They can connect everything from hospitals to funeral homes like ours, then to crematoriums, all in one transport process. They've opened a branch in Luogia City, too. Not long ago, Winnie even got their call, wanting to cooperate with our house.
Grandfather won't agree.
Sylvan said.
Of course, Father won't agree, and I won't either. Do you know how those people work? They transport bodies in bulk, then organize mass funerals followed by mass cremations or burials. To those capitalists, it's like selling vegetables on the street. They only see money, don't understand respect for the deceased, don't know how to respect remains.
Hearing this, Sylvan couldn't help but recall the image of Jeff and Mr. Mosan bumping together, almost kissing in the hearse earlier. Uncle, do you have the face to say respect?
Our house is still better off. Although they plan to infringe on our customer base because of your grandfather's connections, our business can still hold on.
Uncle Mason's tone dropped significantly.
But things are starting to get difficult for Mrs. Hughes.
At this point, Ron, who was pushing Mr. Mosan's stretcher in front, turned his head and shouted,
Aha, that's why I support the Accord Party. Only they're willing to beat those damn capitalists back.
After saying this, Ron even raised his fist a bit. Sylvan had read about the Accord Party in the newspaper a few days ago. It was a left-wing party that developed well in Luogia City in recent years. However, upon hearing Accord Party, Uncle Mason immediately shouted,
Are you crazy? Only lunatics would support those people coming to power. They'll only make our current lives a mess.
Ron shrugged, seemingly too lazy to argue with the boss, and continued pushing the stretcher. Sylvan looked at Uncle Mason's reddened neck. He could sympathize, understanding the weakness of the petty bourgeois class. After walking down a not-too-long corridor, Sylvan and the others finally pushed the stretchers to the cremation room. 3 furnaces were in the cremation room, but only one was operating. Through the glass window, Sylvan saw a man with messy hair and a scruffy beard sitting on the ground. At this moment, the furnace that had been operating also stopped. A gray-haired but energetic-looking worker opened the door and shouted at the man,
"Sir, please come receive your wife."
Then this old worker saw Mason, smiled, and waved.
"Hey, Mason."
Old Darcy.
Uncle Mason stepped forward, offering old Darcy a cigarette.
"How many today?"
Old Darcy asked while lighting up. Mason held up 2 fingers.
"Well, well. God have mercy on you."
Old Darcy grinned, delighting in Mason's misfortune. He clearly understood how much a lost cremation meant for the Inmarace house. In fact, they wouldn't actually lose money, but burial could earn much more profit. Losing that potential profit effectively became a loss.
"Sir, please come receive your wife."
Old Darcy exhaled a smoke ring and urged again. The man looked up, confused, and then quietly stood up. When he saw the cremation furnace through the glass window, he leaned back against the wall again, seemingly resisting everything before him. Indeed, who could immediately accept their beloved turning into a handful of ashes? Sylvan heard Uncle Mason whisper to old Darcy.
What's going on?
Old Darcy took a drag on his cigarette, showing a contemptuous look and shaking his head slightly, whispering back,
"No tip. Didn't even buy an urn."
If customers gave a tip or bought items from the company, they'd undoubtedly enjoy some special services. For example, if you were afraid or unwell, old Darcy, the furnace worker, would help put the ashes in the urn and hand them to you. Of course, some people wanted to collect their loved one's ashes themselves. In that case, old Darcy would help carefully crush the bones to make it easier. It wasn't clear if this man had no money or honestly didn't understand these things. In his eyes, there was nothing but confusion. Seeing his dazed look, old Darcy scornfully said,
"He's a psychology professor, yet he doesn't even understand these basics."
Huh? This occupation caught Sylvan's attention. What a coincidence. He'd met a fellow colleague. Chapter 23. There's a Monster. 3. Sylvan took the initiative to step forward, looking at the man and saying softly,
You should go receive your wife now, sir.
I...
The man's hands were shaking. It was evident he was going through an intense psychological struggle. In fact, people who have lived together with strong emotional bonds after a loved one's death usually don't feel the kind of horror towards the remains or ashes that you see in ghost movies. Instead, they feel quite normal. But there are some special emotions and psychological states. For instance, in his previous life, Sylvan had a patient who loved his wife dearly, but when she was giving birth, he chose to be in the delivery room with her. It was a loving act, but from that moment on, he was haunted by a severe psychological shadow, eventually choosing to divorce his wife. What's worse, afterward, he would tremble in fear at the sight of women and children.
"You're afraid of your own wife?"
Old Darcy urged.
"Hurry up, people are waiting in line."
I'm not afraid.
The man's face showed a struggle and self-blame. Clearly, old Darcy's words, "You're afraid of your own wife," had caused this husband to feel deep guilt and self-reproach. The mind can be divided into physiological and psychological aspects. The psychological is truly easier to overcome, but the physiological is not so simple.
I'm not afraid of her. It's that
Sylvan sighed, reaching out to pat the man's shoulder. All right, out of respect for a colleague. Sylvan turned, walking up to Mason.
Uncle, we're in a hurry to get home. Let me help him collect the ashes.
Hearing this, old Darcy felt a bit disgruntled, saying indifferently,
"Your nephew's truly kind-hearted."
but his tone carried no hint of praise. Mason shrugged, saying,
Old Darcy? I need to hurry home. If I'm late, Mary will scold me again.
Fine.
Old Darcy had given up.
You push the remains up first, I'll collect them.
Ron pushed Mr. Mosan in. Sylvan hesitated momentarily, but still helped Ron lift Mr. Mosan onto the cremation furnace platform. Although Mr. Mosan had shown his spirit last night, expressing his obsession that he didn't want to be cremated, Sylvan had no way to help him. even though the previous Sylvan had left 6,000 lu, enough to buy a coffin. What about burial costs? Most importantly, what reason or authority did he have to demand the family provide above-standard treatment for a regular customer? Grandfather was still alive. Even if grandfather wasn't around, uncle was still there. This house wasn't his to decide yet. After finishing these tasks, Sylvan trudged over to old Darcy's side and watched him use an iron hook to pull the ashes. Old Darcy turned his head to glance at Sylvan standing behind him and asked,
First time here?
Yes.
Never seen it before?
Never.
Truly a young master.
Old Darcy mocked. An Inmarace man is seeing ashes for the first time. Sylvan pointed at a pile of bones on the ground and asked,
Aren't these supposed to be ashes?
He emphasized the word ashes a bit more. In his impression, ashes should be white, like flour after cremation. But what he saw before him was a pile of bone fragments. There were ashes, but bones made up the majority and were quite large. Old Darcy said puzzledly,
This is how it is.
Ah, I see.
Sylvan was startled, realizing he had been deceived by TV shows and movies from his previous life. At this moment, seeing old Darcy throw his finished cigarette butt on the ground, Sylvan felt his pocket, took out the cigarette pack Paul had given him, pulled out a cigarette, and offered it to old Darcy. Old Darcy took the cigarette, his expression notably improved, but he didn't forget to remind,
Good people don't need to be like this.
Haha.
Sylvan understood his meaning and could only explain,
He once came to our school and taught a class. You could say he was my teacher.
Hearing this reason, old Darcy nodded.
I see.
Immediately, old Darcy put a glove on his left hand, his right hand holding a small iron hammer, and squatted down. He began tapping these large bone pieces, breaking them into smaller fragments.
Is this how everyone collects ashes?
Sylvan asked curiously. Old Darcy nodded, saying,
Most people only take a portion.
Ah,
Sylvan continued,
then why?
I'm doing this out of respect for your uncle.
Old Darcy continued, tapping the bones.
And respect for your grandfather.
The large bone fragments were broken one by one. Old Darcy paused his actions and pointed to the display shelf in front, where a series of various urn styles were placed.
Bring one over.
Ah, all right.
Sylvan went over, glancing around, and discovered that even the cheapest urn was priced at 1,000 lu, which is equivalent to half a month's salary for an ordinary worker. Of course, there were more expensive ones. Sylvan saw an urn priced at 50,000 lu, its exquisite and noble exterior. However, it was quite dusty, clearly having been there for a long time. After all, many families choose cremation, apart from religious beliefs because it's cheaper than burial, so this 50,000 lu urn must be very difficult to move. Sylvan picked up the 1,000 lu urn and brought it to old Darcy.
I'll have my uncle pay you for it.
Old Darcy waved his hand, saying generously,
No need.
How can that be? It's a whole 1,000 lu.
Cost is 50. Wholesale price is always cheaper.
Damn it, too deep. This is the legendary black shop. Old Darcy asked somewhat puzzledly.
You've never helped with the family business before?
No.
This part of the memory truly didn't exist in the previous Sylvan's mind.
No wonder then. Your family sells coffins and clothes. Not much different from this.
Really?
Sylvan smiled embarrassedly. Haha, so our family is just as deep. Chapter 24. There's a Monster 4. Old Darcy began collecting the ashes, arranging them in the urn based on the size and shape of the bone fragments. The ashes were clearly sorted and extremely orderly, making Sylvan feel as if he were arranging a dish. Finally, almost nothing was left. Old Darcy had put nearly all the ashes into the urn. The sturdy skull was hard to incinerate completely and was placed at the top center. Then with a click, old Darcy locked the urn.
Take it to him.
All right, thank you, sir.
Sylvan bent down to pick up the urn. It was hard to imagine that this was a living person not long ago. Even before entering the incinerator, she was still a complete person. Now, an entire person was in this box in his hands. Sylvan walked out. When he approached the man instinctively reached out his hands, then hesitated fearfully.
She...
I'm bringing your wife out, sir. Please don't mind. Now, I'm returning her to you.
Hearing this, the man's face immediately lightened considerably. His tone of voice also became slightly steadier.
No, you are truly a gentleman.
He finally reached out, taking the urn containing his wife's ashes and hugging it to his chest.
My Linda, has she really left?
Sylvan replied,
In terms of physical form, I suppose so.
Then,
The man looked up, his eyes showing a glimmer of hope.
But in the spiritual world, she's still alive in your mind. As long as you remember her, she'll always be there.
yes, yes.
The man nodded repeatedly.
As long as I remember her, she'll always be there. She's still by my side. No, she's even closer to me now, my Linda.
A smile appeared on the man's face, warm like sunshine.
Linda believed in the Berry Church. According to their doctrine, her remains needed to be cremated. You know, bringing her to the crematorium was like a form of torture for me. Thank you. Linda has left, and friends around me all advised me to face reality to accept her departure. You're the first one to tell me that she's still here. Thank you. I'm truly extremely grateful to you.
You're welcome.
The man hugged the urn, turning to leave. Sylvan quietly leaned against the corridor wall, slowly pulling out a cigarette. At this moment, Mason came over, asking a bit angrily,
When did you learn to smoke? Who taught you?
Sylvan replied.
Aunt Mary.
Sylvan wasn't lying. His first cigarette in this world since waking up was indeed given by Aunt Mary.
Ah, all right.
Uncle Mason immediately changed his tone and switched topics.
Sylvan, you're kind-hearted, but you can't help everyone. If you get used to being kind, you'll find that too many people in this world need help.
Uncle,
Sylvan wanted to explain but couldn't use the colleague reason, so he could only nod and say,
Yes, I know I can't help everyone.
No, it's not about whether you can help. But when you discover more and more people need your help and you can't do anything, you'll feel pain.
Sylvan was stunned momentarily, then nodded, saying, You're right, Uncle. Mason was satisfied with Sylvan's attitude. He shrugged and said,
Besides, you often won't receive good returns when you do good deeds.
Just as he finished speaking, the man who had left with the urn returned. He stood before Sylvan, bowing to him for the second time. This bow caught Sylvan off guard, and he instinctively bowed back.
I'm so sorry, I forgot. I haven't paid for the urn yet.
The man took out an old wallet that had seen better days. However, all the adjectives described earlier were meaningless, because the critical point in determining a wallet's condition is its thickness. It was very thick, bulging to the point it couldn't even close. The 100 Lu bills featured the image of Emperor Rotland, famous in Ruilan's history. In the wallet now, Emperor Rotland was almost stretched to the point of bursting out. So he wasn't unable to pay for cremation, nor unable to tip, nor unable to buy an urn. He simply hadn't thought about those things, having no experience spending money for something like this.
I paid the cremation fee earlier. May I ask how much the urn costs?
The man asked,
I'm sorry, I almost forgot and just left holding Linda's hand.
Fee. 1,000 Lu.
Sylvan had been about to say 50, but then he thought about how old Darcy had helped, collecting the ashes very well. This 1,000 Lu should be used to put the ashes in the urn. He didn't think about profiting from this. After all, in his previous life, he wasn't short of small change. In this life, he also didn't need to worry about food and drink for now. The previous Sylvan had even saved 6,000 Lu for him for the plan to leave home.
All right.
The man took out all the money from his wallet, handing Sylvan a thick wad of bills. The thickness, the weight. Uncle Mason's eyes were about to pop out looking at it. Sylvan, who hadn't been moved by a small change earlier, now had his eyes widening too. This giant stack of money was at least 20,000 lu, if not more. Instinctively swallowing, Sylvan opened his mouth and said,
You've given a bit too much.
It's not too much. This is for your psychological consultation and your psychological service. It's worth this price. No, you brought Linda back to me. This money can't even compare to what you've done for me. But this time, I only managed to withdraw this much cash from the bank in a hurry. If I had known, I should have taken out more.
No, it's enough, it's more than enough.
Sylvan hurriedly consoled him.
I didn't bring my business card. My name is Piaget Adams. Do you have a business card? I hope we can keep in touch for future research and discussions.
I don't have...
Yes?
Uncle Mason immediately took out one of his business cards and handed it over. It had the following printed on it: Inmare's Funeral Service Company. Piaget took the card, smiling and saying,
I'll come to greet you at this address in the future. Thank you again.
With that, Piaget bowed to Sylvan once more. Sylvan, holding the large stack of money, immediately bowed back, right after Piaget held hands with his wife and left again. Chapter 25. There's a Monster. 5. While old Darcy was still cleaning the furnace for the next guest, Sylvan counted out 1,000 alu, preparing to give it to old Darcy later. Sylvan handed the remaining money to Mason. Mason just smiled, pushing the money back, saying,
You keep it yourself.
Don't we need to put it in the company funds, Xiao?
Sylvan asked. Money might smell good, but compared to life was definitely more important. If this income was submitted, look this, I can not only cook, but I can also make money. So please don't kill me.
He said it was some kind of fee for you. Ah, the consultation fee. That's yours. You received it? So keep it. Or tomorrow, I'll take you to the bank to open a savings account.
Thank you, Uncle.
No need to thank me.
Mason reached out, patting Sylvan's shoulder, asking,
Just now, you and that guy, Piaget, I overheard your conversation. Although I didn't understand much, I could feel that you seemed to have solved his problem very well. Why didn't I know before that you could talk to others like that?
Previously, Sylvan was autistic. How could he talk to others?
I learned it from books.
Ah, I see. After we get back, I'll discuss it with your aunt. We might expand into another category, like this time, psychological counseling, or maybe psychological therapy. You know, the relatives of the deceased, they're often very sad and need someone to help them cope. Sylvan understood what Mason meant. In fact, in his previous life's world, high-end funeral homes would have psychological counselors talk to the bereaved families, providing counseling.
Can you do this?
Mason continued to ask,
You don't have to force yourself.
I can, no problem.
Sylvan answered decisively due to confidence in his expertise.
That's great. You don't know. Every time I see those grieving families, I feel heartbroken for them.
Mason clutched his chest.
Uncle, you're so kind-hearted.
Because I know when people have these emotions, they're not rational. They'll spend more lavishly than usual, yet we don't have this service to milk them for money. Thinking about this, I feel so heartbroken. Do you really want to give old Darcy 1,000 lu?
Mason asked. Sylvan nodded.
All right, I'll go give it to him.
Mason took the 1,000 lu and went inside to find old Darcy. Inside the glass wall, old Darcy used an iron hook to slash open Mr. Mosan's belly. Then he pushed him into the furnace. Sylvan saw Mason approach old Darcy. Old Darcy was first surprised, then smiled, even deliberately turning around to tip his hat and bow towards Sylvan outside the glass wall. At the same time, Ron staggered out, lighting a cigarette to relax.
Ron.
Ah, anything I can do, young Master Sylvan?
Sylvan took out 500 lu and handed it to Ron.
This money.
Ron was a bit confused.
The gentleman from earlier gave it. You deserve a share.
Really? Thank you, young master, thank you.
Ron happily pocketed the money. He didn't have a wife, but he still had to pay last month's debts every month after getting paid. With this extra 500 lu, he could splurge at the bar for 2 nights. Sylvan suddenly asks,
By the way, Ron, was Jeff's body collected because the government agency called you?
Ron, completely off guard, answered directly,
No, that morning we were originally going to Crystal Flower Nursing Home to pick up Mr. Mo-san. But passing by Mint Street, number 125 or 130 or something, we found Jeff frozen to death there, right next to the street trash can in front. We had to bring Jeff back before picking up Mr. Mo-san, and Mr. Mason applied for the welfare ticket afterward.
As expected, Uncle Mason's words when driving past Building 128 immediately came to Sylvan's mind.
However, the other day her family encountered some trouble. She asked me for help, so I helped a bit. She and her husband are looking for a new house to prepare to move.
So Uncle helped his first love's family dispose of a corpse. Wait. Sylvan suddenly realized a problem. He had seen some images on the remains of Mr. Mo-san and Jeff. The obsession about not wanting to be cremated had been confirmed by Aunt Mary. Because of his religion, Mr. Mosen strongly resisted cremation. If what he saw in Mo-san was true, then the woman he saw in Jeff, with only 2 legs and a face, wasn't that real too? In Sylvan's mind, the scene of the 2nd floor, when passing by that house, immediately appeared. Those 2 legs and those red high heels. So the family of Uncle's first love at this moment has a monster. This is the end of today's story. Please like and subscribe to support the channel and follow the next developments. Thank you.